In this edition of the Red and Blue Political Roundup, President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was sentenced to more time in prison Wednesday. A federal judge in Washington sentenced the 69-year-old on conspiracy charges. He is now facing nearly 7 years in prison on a number of charges uncovered during special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. Manafort is also facing new legal trouble in New York, where the Manhattan District Attorney announced a new indictment against him. A grand jury charged Manafort with 16 counts, including fraud. President Trump was asked about Manafort's legal situation at the White House earlier.
I feel very badly for Paul Manafort. And, he worked for Ronald Reagan very successfully. He worked for John McCain. He worked for Bob Dole and many others for many years.
Will you pardon Paul Manafort?
I have not even given it a thought as of this moment. It's not something that's right now on my mind. I do feel badly for Paul Manafort. That I can tell you.
Let's bring in Niall Stanage. She's a White House columnist for The Hill. Niall, thanks so much for being with us. How do you read the president's comments? Is he trying to distance himself at all from Paul Manafort?
He is, to the extent that he mentions Mr. Manafort's work for other prominent Republican politicians of the past. That's clearly an attempt to loosen the knot that ties Paul Manafort to the president. Mr. Manafort, of course, served as Mr. Trump's campaign chairman, then candidate Trump's campaign chairman. But it was interesting that he did not close the door on a pardon either, obviously expressing significant amounts of sympathy for Paul Manafort. That's something that I think people will be keeping a very close eye on in the time to come.
Regarding the sentencing, what does this mean for the rest of the Mueller investigation? Is it possible to tell?
I think it is a victory for the Mueller team. When Mr. Manafort received a lighter than expected sentence last week, that did cast a not particularly positive light on the Mueller investigation. The judge last week was certainly rather defensive of Paul Manafort in some ways, and by extension a bit sceptical of the Mueller team. This is not the case in this sentencing today. This really does emphasise and does confirm that these are serious crimes that Paul Manafort committed. The judge today much less forgiving or generous in her interpretation of his actions.
At the same time, former acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker met with the House Judiciary Committee Wednesday. I want to play some of what the committee's chairman, New York Congressman Jerry Nadler, had to say about their meeting.
One, unlike in the hearing room, Mr. Whitaker did not deny that the president called him to discuss the Michael Cohen case and personnel decisions in the Southern District. Two, while he was acting Attorney General, Mr. Whitaker was directly involved in conversations about whether to fire one or more U.S. attorneys. And three, while he was acting Attorney General, Mr. Whitaker was involved in conversations about the scope of the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney Berman's recusal, and whether the Southern District went too far in pursuing the campaign finance case in which the president was listed as individual number one.
So, Niall, what does this mean for President Trump?
It adds to the cloud of suspicion that is over him, at least in the mind of his critics. This goes to the idea that President Trump is prone to making inappropriate interventions. His most ardent critics would say that this comes close to the obstruction of justice charge that they have often levelled at him. But I mean, I think more generally, Elaine, there had been a pretty well understood norm in this country that presidents do not interfere in specific investigations to point them in one direction or another. If what Chairman Nadler said in that clip is true, then that adds to the evidence that President Trump is prone to transgressing those norms. And that's something that does concern people, not all of them Liberals or Democrats, but some, for example, conservative legal scholars as well.
Well, switching topics, the Senate is expected to vote Thursday to block President Trump's national emergency declaration. Is the White House doing anything to try to influence GOP lawmakers who might vote with Democrats?
It's trying, but it's, I think, regarded as a losing battle at this stage. Mercedes Schlapp, a White House aide, today was talking about the need for Republican unity. But I think that ship has sailed, to be perfectly honest. We now know that 5 Republican senators are willing to support this declaration or this motion registering disapproval at the emergency declaration. That's enough to carry that measure. The White House name of the game for the moment is trying to limit those defections so that they don't go any further. Our own reporting at The Hill suggests that they very well could go further. There are at least another 5 or 6 Republican senators who could be added to the existing tally of lawmakers who are willing to buck the president on this issue.
And on that point, how concerned is the White House about further splits between congressional Republicans and the president?
Well, it's obviously politically embarrassing for the White House. They would much prefer Republican senators and congressmen to back them up in all circumstances. In this particular instance, it's, I think, especially contentious because it goes to the issue of the border wall. That was one of the president's signature promises, etc. So here you have Republicans splitting on a fairly fundamental issue, Elaine, saying that President Trump is setting a precedent that is dangerous, that could give, as they would see it, Democratic presidents of the future sweeping powers. So this is a significant measure, though, of course, we don't expect Congress to be able to override a presidential veto on the matter.
Well, President Trump also announced Wednesday that the U.S. was grounding all 737 MAX aircraft flying in the U.S. Was the White House under any pressure to make that decision?
Certainly, because a number of other nations had already either grounded those aircraft or banned them from their airspace. There had been growing concern here in the United States about the FAA's refusal or disinclination to do so. And, you know, without sounding too macabre here, obviously if there were an incident on US soil with one of these airplanes, that would be A, tragic for anyone involved, but B, a political catastrophe where the administration's seen as negligent in letting those planes fly. So I think this was a eventual recognition of that pressure and of those political dynamics on the part of the president and the administration.
And what do you make of the president announcing that decision and not a representative from the FAA?
Interesting. I mean, the president does have a personal relationship with the CEO of Boeing, and Boeing contributed to his inauguration committee, for example. But I think the president, having endured the kind of pressure that we just mentioned, probably did see a political usefulness in putting his face to the declaration that these jets would be grounded, making it clear that this was his decision. And indeed, it was a decision that was welcomed even by lawmakers who are sometimes extremely critical of the president. Al Green, a Democratic congressman for Texas, who has called for the president's impeachment for other reasons, was among the people who welcomed this particular decision.
I also want to ask you about the UK's decision to leave the European Union, also known as Brexit. The country's parliament rejected a plan to leave the EU without a proper withdrawal agreement in place, and will vote Thursday on a plan to delay their departure until June. So, Niall, how closely is the White House watching this?
Well, it's clearly a major international development or an international crisis in a way. Now, the direct implications of it for American citizens, save those who, of course, live in Britain or Europe, is somewhat limited. But it is a crisis in Britain. It's one that is enormously complex. It's one that there is not any obvious route out of right now. And we'll have to see, as you say, there's the vote to delay the actual official exit. But what we don't know is whether there is any workable plan to reach the kind of agreement that has so far eluded Theresa May's government on this issue, whether an extra 2 or 3 months would be sufficient to change that very basic fact.
Well, and do we know what this would mean for U.S. trade interests with the UK and other European countries?
Well, I mean, if Britain does completely exit the European Union, both President Trump and Theresa May have suggested that the US and the UK could strike their own bilateral trade deal. That would be the most obvious way to respond to this. There is a willingness on both sides, clearly, to do that. But trade agreements, as we know, are enormously complicated. They involve a great deal of minutiae, of really getting down into the weeds. So it's not as if the UK would go through with its official exit from the European Union and sign a trade deal with the United States the next day or the next week.
All right, Niall Stanage in Washington. Niall, thank you.
Thanks.